Hi, can you hear me well? Okay. So first of all, thank you for coming. And before I start with the presentation, I want to mention two things. One, whenever we were doing a presentation, investigation in the last couple of years, at one point I would end up watching a conference talk that was giving at Virus Bulletin, so I know about the outstanding research that has been presented here, and that's why it's wild to me that I'm on the stage today. Let me introduce myself briefly, Hakan Tanriverdi. I work for public broadcasting in Germany, so I work as a reporter, as a journalist, basically like the BBC in the UK. And the second thing I want to tell before I start with the keynote is that while I'm the one standing on the stage today, nothing that I'm going to talk about is just my work. It's always going to be a bigger investigation. It's always going to be teamwork, so keep that in the back of your mind. The one thing I describe our team with, the one thing we have is time. So our investigations usually take around at least 3 months, but the last two we did close to a year. So we had a story about a group called Snake and how we were able to tie them just by looking at openly available information to the Russian intelligence agency FSB. And that took us about close to a year. And another investigation we had was on a crew called R-Evil, so they do ransomware, and we were able to find out who one core member is by finding our personal Bitcoin address and tying it to the ransomware operation, and that took a year as well, and look, close to a year. So, oh nice, I just noticed this. I can see what I'm going to say. The keynote is titled, "Why Are You Telling Me This?" and there are two reasons for it. So whenever I speak with researchers, such as yourself, or government officials, and they tell me something that I do find interesting, in the back of my head, I will have the question, what's in it for you? Why are you telling me this? So that's one reason. The second reason is not me asking the question, but you, so the audience. In journalism, you have a thing called the nut graph, and it basically means that whenever you read an article, in the 5th paragraph or so, there will be a sentence along the lines of, hey, this hacker group has been secretly infiltrating the networks of that government for close to a year, and here is why that's important for you to know. So as a journalist, you have to anticipate your audience because they're going to ask the question, why am I reading this? Why am I viewing this? Why are you telling me this? So let me start with the second part, the journalistic view on things. So when I was asked whether I would want to give this keynote, I thought to myself, hey, this is a very technical conference. What can I even talk about? I don't have a background in information science. I don't do incident response. I can't reverse engineer malware. So what else is there? And then I thought about it and came to understand that whenever there's a big article in the news media, people within this community will sort of reverse engineer, try to find out how the reporter knew what they knew, pick line by line apart the reporting, and guess how the article got made in the first place. And that's a problem because journalism can, to many people, be a black box if you're outside looking in, if you're not within media. And since I saw some people on Twitter and somewhere else discussing the work that I did, I thought to myself, it could be interesting to let you know how reporters such as myself are able to find information and where we do this. And ideally, you'll come away from this talk realizing A, how journalists are listening to what you are saying when you're talking with them, but B, also what you choose not to speak of. And you will be able to use this in one of two ways. One is you'll be better able to protect yourself against journalists, if that is what you want. But you could also use this information to understand what journalists are looking for and then directly reaching out to them because you have a better understanding of what might be interesting to them. So let me get to the first reason, the one in which I think to myself, why is this researcher, why is this government official telling me this? I came up with 5 reasons, mostly because out of time constraints. Some of them are obvious. I'll start with one that is not. So the first reason why people tell me stuff is basically they're not telling me this. They're not telling me this in my function as a journalist. And I'll walk you through it with an example. So this is a document published by Clear Sky Cybersecurity. It's titled Raw Threat Intelligence. And as you can see, it's a Google Doc. And every entry starts with the year and suspicious Lazarus documents. And they find unfinished but interesting things they were able to find out. So this document has 239 pages, and if I were to ask you, who do you think they wrote it for, the answer would be, I think it's safe to say, they wrote this for researchers, people in this community to pick up on hashes, look at infrastructure, and maybe find out something more. So it's information sharing. They didn't have journalists in mind, is what I would like to think, because they're not telling me this, they're reaching out to the community. And I want to walk through this one document so you get a better understanding how, as a reporter, I do interact with their findings. So in 2020, they had an entry, and that entry was about a group called Muddy Water, supposedly operating out of Iran. And they were able to find a server, and on that server, there was a TXT file with communication logs. And the communication logs basically dealt with connections made by the victim, received by the C2 server. So I read that sentence and thought to myself, okay, this might mean that I might be able to talk with affected entities, with so-called victims. I don't like the term victims, but yeah. They said there were victims in Pakistan, Turkey, US, Canada, and Germany. The emojis are not showing right here, I don't know why. And here is what they published right at the below. You can see the hash file. It's an MD5 hash and the file name. So a couple of years ago, this is where my research would have stopped because I don't have a virus total account. There's no way that I'm going to get the data. Nowadays, I know, obviously, if I ask a researcher, hey, I have an MD5 hash for you. It's up on virus total. Can you pull that file from me and send it my way? Most of the researchers will say yes because they're nice people and they want to help a journalist in need, basically. And here's what that file looks like. It's just base 64. I wrote a script to decode it. Here are two relevant IP addresses we'll talk about briefly, and this is CyberChef, which does that automatically for you. The two IP addresses, again, the one thing to know is one line per connection. You have the IP address, you have the user agent that was received by the C2 server. Here are the two IP addresses, and the thing you need to know about these IP addresses is that they were not included in Clear Sky's blog post, unfinished raw threat intelligence document. To be frank, they have good reasons for not including these IP addresses, and you'll understand in a second why that is. But what I want you to understand is how reporters will look at what you publish, but also compare it to the primary sources and look at what is in there that you did not speak about. So these two IP addresses belong to Bayer AG. Bayer AG is a German company. They are one of the most valuable ones doing part of the chemical industry. And at that point, I'm hooked because I'm thinking, okay, so Bayer AG's network was reaching out to this C2 server, and we know that it is operated by Muddy Water. That could be a news story. So I started talking with researchers and wanted to understand whether I might be able to find additional proof. I wasn't. And the interesting thing about Bayer AG was we published a story a year ago, so this was in 2019. Bayer AG was actually breached by another entity called WinNTI. So I thought to myself, okay, if they were breached in 2019, who's to say that they weren't breached a year after that happened again, just by a different APT, which happens quite often. I had no proof, and there are always other explanations that can be possible, which is why, as a journalist, you always have to reach out and ask for comment. We just can't publish what we have without giving the other side the chance to react to our findings. And here's what Bayer AG told me. It's in German, so I'll translate it. They said, nothing to worry about. These two IP addresses are part of our cyber defense center. We use it to run and check for malware to better protect our network. And for me, there was an interesting investigation, if you want, especially for the reason because I came to understand with this concrete example that just having a C2 server and seeing who connects to it doesn't have to mean anything really. And also, there was no story that was published because there was no breach. But as a journalist, it's also important sometimes to just look at something and come away with a better understanding that might not always result in a story. So to recap, if you want to publish something, you really can't choose your audience as a researcher, even if you tailor it to a technical community. If a journalist knows people who are kind enough to walk them through specific findings, they will get that information as well. So you can't choose your audience. That's why you're telling me reason number one. Oh, I forgot. Can I have water? I don't need a glass. I'll keep talking. Thank you very much. The second reason is you're telling me this because you don't know you're telling me this. So basically, in your industry, you have a thing called TLP, which is, thank you, which is traffic light protocol, which a way for you to understand what information is to be shared and what not. Red is you don't share it, amber is, I think, within your organization, and green, you can share it. Journalists have a similar kind of rule set. There are 3 rules, and I'll walk you through them quickly. The first one is on the record. If you talk with a reporter and you haven't agreed on anything, then by default, everything you say is on the record, meaning it can be used in an article. You can be quoted. I can name your company. I can tell my audience who you are and how you know what you know. The second rule is on background. On background means I can agree with you before we start our conversation that some things you say I can use, but other information I'm not allowed to use. So I can quote you, but I can't tell my audience that you work at, I don't know, at Google or Mandiant or whatever, then you'll be an anonymous source. Anonymous not to me, but anonymous to the audience. And the third rule is off the record. Off the record basically means nothing you say will be used for publication at all. This conversation never happened. So what I do is I almost always keep it off the record. And immediately you might think, why would I do that? If you tell me something interesting and I can't use it, then I'm at a disadvantage. What's the benefit? So unless I'm pursuing a specific story, I want the researchers to be as open as possible. So if I talk with them and they have in the back of their mind, hey, if I talk about that stuff, it might get me into trouble, so I'd rather not mention it, that is also to my disadvantage. So I thought it's better for me to keep it off record, and if during the conversation something pops up that's interesting, I will ask a question like, I would love to follow up on that. Am I allowed to reach out to other people and find out what you were referring to? And here's a concrete example. I was talking and basically just gossiping with a researcher, and it resulted in a story. The researcher told me, hey, there's a government agency, they sent out an alert, and in that alert, they were talking about an APT group that was targeting the automotive industry in Germany. I thought to myself, hey, interesting enough, can I follow up on that? The person said, sure, do your thing, no worries. And he mentioned, if you are able to get that agency alert, look for the IP addresses. I was able to get the alert. And again, there was an IP address. This time, I looked at passive DNS data. The thing you need to know is the group the government agency was talking about is called Ocean Lotus. Allegedly, they're operating out of Vietnam. And I have now three pieces of information. One, I have the alert, so the attack is ongoing. Otherwise, the agency wouldn't have sent out that alert. Two, I know that's about that it is targeting the automotive industry. And three, with the IP address, looking just at passive DNS data, I have a time frame, and I can look and see that these two domains, bmwthailand.org and bmw-corp.net, were part of that specific IP address. I did some further reporting and was able to find out that BMW, in fact, had been hacked by Ocean Lotus during a specific time frame. I think it was in spring 2019. The attackers used Cobalt Strike. And BMW, at one point, noticed the ongoing intrusion, monitored the hackers, and kicked them out afterwards before they could reach Munich. So reason number two why you are telling me this is because I try to create an environment in which you might feel safe enough to talk openly about things. And the reason I'm doing it is because we might have different understanding of the word interesting. Researchers talk about techniques, about new botnets, APTs, and what they do, new techniques they're using, and so on. And journalists will always ask the question, okay, how did they use it, and who did they target? Which brings us to reason number three. Why are you telling me this? You want me to do something. This one seems obvious, but let's think it through. So during the Ocean Lotus investigation, many researchers I spoke with asked me, why are you so interested in the automotive industry? These guys are known for targeting dissidents, especially those living abroad, but also living in Vietnam. you might want to look into that. I was given 2 blog posts. One is this by Volexity in 2017, and this one by Trend Micro in 2018. And the researcher basically told me, just have a look at the IOCs, all you need to do. What I did was to find this delivery document in the Trend Micro blog post, SHA-256. It was, again, up on VirusTotal, but also on hybrid analysis. And what I love to do is, after pulling the file, especially if it's a delivery document, there's so much information, who they are targeting and why. And here's a screenshot from the hybrid analysis sandbox, I think. And you can clearly see it says Stuttgart. Stuttgart is a city in southern Germany. And there was a conference that is organized every 2 years, and in 2018 it was taking place in Stuttgart. So what the researcher wanted me to do, but they didn't say that explicitly, was to come across that Stuttgart piece of information and then just reach out to the organization, to the one who organized the conference. And if they speak to me, I might be able and publish an article, and then the community will learn as well why these groups are targeting these specific people, which is what I did. And here's that person, Wu Nop-Yen. He organized the conference. He came to Germany in the 70s. He's quite well known in Vietnam. He writes about, he published a magazine in which poets and political activists discussed pathways for Vietnam to democratize. And he didn't know about the ongoing thing, which is, just for 1 second, if I understand it correctly, some of the researchers will not reach out to the affected entities and tell them that they've been targeted for 2 reasons. One, it might be intimidating, or you're telling them, hey, you've been hacked and now buy our product. That is why many people don't do it. And the second reason seems to be, if you have hundreds of targets, are you going to reach out to all of them? So they might not end up doing it. But as a journalist, it's my job to do that, to talk with as many people as possible. And in that case, we spoke with him. He didn't know that he was being targeted. He wasn't too surprised because he told us that the government of Vietnam has a clear interest of finding out what they are willing to do when it comes to Vietnam. And here's the second person, Bui Tan Hugh. He's known as the Wind Trader on Facebook. 200,000 people are subscribed to his updates. And he was sent a specific spearfishing document. Now, and here is that document. And the interesting thing about this document is when he received it, around the same time, he had heard that the government of Vietnam was paying somebody to attend the conference and then report back to the government who attended and what they were talking about. And the interesting thing to me personally is to see how cyber espionage might intertwine with actual ongoing physical presence, regular espionage. And this is a good example for this. So the email is well timed. It is in the weeks before the conference is supposed to take place. So obviously, I don't know if I wouldn't have clicked on the link. Bui Tan Hugh clicked on the link because he didn't notice that the email at the sender, there was an extra TH, so it wasn't actually from the conference, but from the hackers. We published our findings, and after we did that, Amnesty International did their own analysis and also was able to basically corroborate our findings. So this is reason number 3 why I know what I know. Because researchers want to find out anything, some specific information, they might not be able to do so, so they pass it along. And then by us publishing, get more context to better understand how a specific APT group is operating. Which brings us to reason number 4. And that one is you want to use me, which is fine. You can try. Journalists have huge platforms, and if we publish in our story in the main news, it'll reach millions of folks. So if you have interesting research, by any means, reach out. It's PR. It's part of regular. There's nothing wrong with it. It has its place. But if we look at the reporting that's out there, which groups are written about, most of them are allegedly operated out of China, Iran, North Korea, and maybe Russia. Because there are many reasons for this. Just to name one, there's no known ransomware group operating out of Germany, and if there is, please let me know. And the assumption would be that if there would be a group like that, the law enforcement agencies would prosecute them and try to put them in jail, which is not always the case, especially when it comes to ransomware groups operating out of Russia. But The interesting thing is that these countries are also considered to be strategic adversaries to the US and to Germany, which makes it useful for me because I can try to use it to my advantage. This person, so we did a podcast on a group called APT28. This person is Dimitri Badin. He tried to exfiltrate all the emails out of the parliamentary office of then Chancellor Angela Merkel. But in the malware he wrote, he made a mistake, and that mistake was he forgot to delete his PDB path. So law enforcement officials knew what his client was called. It had the name Scaramouche, and they were able to tie that name Scaramouche to Dimitri Badin, and then there's an arrest warrant against him. And during that investigation, I talked with many people, and I had sort of the feeling that APT28 didn't seem to be that big a deal anymore. This was in 2019, 2020. Which was curious to me because APT28 did hack the DNC in 2016 and the German parliament in 2015, en marche in France in 2017. So why are they not a big deal anymore? I started asking around, and I was pointed to this article by ESET. It's called En Route with SEDNet, and it's part 2, I think. And in it, they describe a tool called Xtunnel. Xtunnel is for reaching machines that are not connected to the internet. And I'm not going too deep into the technical details because I'll trip, I'll make a mistake. The thing you need to know is that each binary has a table composed of 256 rows. And the client wants to authenticate to the server it's really the client, and the server wants to do the same as well. And the server, what the server is doing is basically using a pre-chosen key out of the table of 256 rows and encrypting the string OK with it. Now, if all binaries have the same table, I asked ESET, and they did say to me that that is what they observed, all binaries have the same table, you can just pre-compute every possible variant of that OK. And if you are an intelligence agency and monitoring the internet, you can just then get an alert every time it pops up and know it's an external communication or it's a simulated external communication, one of the two things. Which we published in our podcast, and I had a conference, I was on a panel at a conference, and afterwards was approached by a government official from a European intelligence agency, and basically he also confirmed it happened, but also said the way intelligence agencies work, if you have a finding like this, you'll share it across your partners, and this is why I think I haven't, this is not me 100% knowing it, but this is what I assume, that the US did know about it as well, France as well, and I don't know, the UK maybe. So reason number 4 is you want to see somebody fail, and that's why you speak to a reporter and try to use it because you think it's in the public interest to know. My battery is running low. Do I have it, is this I have 10 minutes left? Reason number 4, why are you telling me this? It's the last one. It's because it's already public. And to be frank, there's so much information out there. I'm personally interested in open source information. I want to find out how I can write my scrapers to find usernames and all that stuff. There are many interesting newsletters. Here's one. It's called Week in OSINT. If you are interested in just cybersecurity news, here are 3 newsletters. This Week in Security, Risky Biz News, and Bad Cyber. If you are interested in just education, here's the Internet Storm Center putting out their research. If you want to follow specific malware, you can subscribe to Yara rules on Malware Bazaar. This is my inbox for our Cobalt Strike Beacon. And how do you keep track? The obvious answer is you can't. You can't keep track. It's just too much. So whenever you assume that I have seen that viral tweet that just lit up in your community, most often I didn't. Just pass it along via DM, please. That would be very nice. But the thing I want you to understand is that for me, it doesn't have to be a disadvantage to not see everything the second it happens. And for that, let's talk about the WinNTI case. WinNTI, I'm not going to go into the discussion whether they're in group or an umbrella. The one thing that's important is that we received a tip back in 2019 that WinNTI stored the target in their actual malware. So in a PE file within the overlay, they would just tell you, hey, this is who we are targeting. This is a screenshot from a blog post published by Kaspersky, and where it says tag was here, there was the campaign ID, so the victim name. And the victim in that case was a well-known global pharmaceutical company headquartered in Europe. We got the file, I wrote a script to look at the overlay and was able to find out that it was Roche in that case. So we knew that we could do this. We knew that it would make sense to write a Yara rule. We set up an account on VirusTotal. They gave us a 2-week trial with a retro hunt of 30 days or 90 days, 90 days, I think. And we got also through other sources close to 300 binaries, analyzed them, and here's another screenshot. You can see the domain, and the domain is Henkel Group. Henkel is a German company, also chemicals. They were targeted by WinNTI as well. We teamed up with a researcher, a reverser called Moritz Kontakt. I think he's with Google now, I'm not sure. And he basically looked at what we did and improved our script, and we just analyzed all the pieces of binaries. So to keep in mind, this blog post by Kaspersky was put out in 2015. I'm looking at it in 2019. So it's not a new technique anymore. As far as I know, WinNTI didn't use it. It was just old stuff. But for me as a journalist, if I want to have a bigger picture, it can be useful to let time pass and then after the fact look at all the databases where all this information is stored to try and find as good an overview as possible, which is what we did in this case. Right at the same time, we were alerted to a GitHub a script on GitHub published by ThyssenKrupp, by the CERT of ThyssenKrupp, because ThyssenKrupp was also targeted. And what they did was write an Nmap tool. Basically, it would tell you if you pointed to an IP address, do they have WinT on there, yes or no? And you can see in the screenshot, port 135, they did find WinNTI. We used that script and just basically ran it against some IP addresses. We heard there might be a live infection, got some other sources as well, and were able to find out what companies were targeted. In our reporting, we identified some of them. And if you look at it, you have TeamViewer, you have Siemens, you have ThyssenKrupp, Bayer, BASF, Covestro, which are all out of Germany. So for our audience, it was immediately interesting to see how one group dash umbrella targeted specifically German companies within a given time frame. And we published that information, and basically it was all done by publicly available information. Nothing was secret, and that's the, I think, beauty of it. I'm being told this stuff because you don't break any rules. You don't breach NDAs. This is nothing that's classified. You're just sending me a link. You can sidestep NDAs, if you will. In conclusion, these were 5 reasons that I wanted to alert you to, how reporters get their information. And why do this in the first place? You have all these companies that publish their blog posts, that do publish their findings. Why do you as a journalist also need to do this stuff? Because my answer would be, as a journalist, you always want to talk to affected entities, and you always want to look at primary sources. And in that case, it might make sense to see what happened and see for yourself and check for yourself and use that information, because as you have seen in the first example, in the Clear Sky one, companies are not always, for valid reason, publishing everything they know, because it's not in their interest to share that publicly. As a reporter, I want to make that judgment myself. Also, I think one problem that journalism covering cybersecurity has is there's a heavy reliance on anonymous sources. And when I write that I spoke with somebody and, dear reader, unfortunately, I can't tell you who I spoke with, that puts me in an awkward position that the reader has to trust that I did what I say I did. But if I go and sort of try to get the evidence basically myself, and I can show it to them and walk them through how we know what we talk about in this specific article, if we show it and not just talk about it, it might give the reader a better understanding of how we came to these conclusions, and they can judge for themselves. So if I then quote somebody anonymously, the audience will think, okay, if they have all done all of this work and got the malware and all the binaries and analyzed that, maybe I can trust them that they also spoke with someone who was aware of what is happening in that hacking campaign. And for that specific reason, it is really, really important, because as a journalist, I wouldn't be able to find out any of that information myself. It's always somebody giving me a tip. It's always somebody spending their time helping me better understand what's happening out there. So I wanted to use this opportunity to also say thank you for telling me all of this. I hope you heard something that was sort of interesting to you. I haven't seen Helen give me the 10-minute sign, so I don't know. More than 10 minutes. Okay, I did talk pretty fast then. I hope it was still interesting enough, and now we have time for questions. So I'll be around today all day and tomorrow until 12, so please say hi. Here's my Twitter, Keybase Wire, whatever you want, just be in touch. And next time won't talk that quickly. But if you have questions, we have time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hakan. Do we have any questions? Okay, let me ask Frisk.
Just wondering if
can you just hang on a sec?
Just wondering if you have ever run into something that really looked like a good story, but for one reason or another, you were totally unable to publish anything.
So whether there was a story, but...
Well, you were convinced there was a story, but for some reason you just couldn't publish it.
There are stories that I know of, and that's the disadvantage part. So people have told me stuff that allegedly happened, and these are people I do trust, but they told me that information in confidence, and at one point I had to stop and think whether I wanted to continue talking to this person, because if they keep telling me stuff that I can't use, and my job is to publish information, it puts me in a weird spot. And I then decided to tell them, listen, we can't talk about all of that stuff off the record all the time, because you're using me as a tool to vent, basically. And that's why I cut that specific conversation at that point in time. Yeah, it might be frustrating to not be able to publish information you think that is out there, and that's one case.
Any more questions? Question over here.
Hi, Hakan. So I just have a question. As a reporter, your job is to, obviously distribute information. Do you ever feel like in doing the research that you do, that you stumble across something that's so dangerous to publish that you can't release it publicly because of the harm it might create? And if so, sort of how do you balance that, that dichotomy?
Thank you for the question. Let me answer this way. So when we had our story on that group called Snake, we had to discuss, and also with our evil, with the ransomware group, we had to have a discussion whether it would be okay to publish it, given that these people are wanted by law enforcement agencies. And if we publish our story, that person, in our evil case, he used to travel. He used to go to Turkey. Turkey is part of NATO, and theoretically, the German government could have sent an extradition request, and the Turkish police would have caught him and sent him to Germany. And we had to have a discussion whether it would be okay for us to still publish our findings. It went on and on. When we first had the discussion, we came back with the answer that we can't publish right away, because we want to have we don't want to rely only on anonymous sources. And it took us 2 to 3 months, I think, to find the Bitcoin address. At that point, we had corroboration that wasn't reliant on anonymous sources. And then something interesting happened, which is the real infrastructure got hacked. I don't know by whom, but it is rumored to be an intelligence agency. And at that point, we thought to ourselves, listen, these guys know they're being watched closely. This was after the Colonial Pipeline hack. no way these guys are going to travel. And since we were able to, we had a good enough vantage point to see when they were traveling or not, because the wife would post on Instagram, and the next time she traveled, she was alone. The first time she was with I don't know if they're married, boyfriend, husband, and the next time she traveled alone, and after they got hacked, we decided, okay, it's okay now to publish because they know they're being watched now. And that's when we made the decision. But it can be tough. It can be hard to not publish because we don't, just by publishing stuff, make it harder for law enforcement to do their job. But sometimes you still have to publish.
We have a question down.
So on the same note as the previous question, did you ever had a story that was perfectly valid, well documented, but you were told by somebody to not publish it? And if yes, what were the reasons and who told you that? Like officials, management, whatever. Of course, I understand that you cannot tell just everything, but just to give us a rough idea.
Let me put it that way. After we published our investigation on Snake, some people were mad at us for having done so because they thought, here you have, we knew that the Germans also knew about these two, we think to be developers of that malware. And they told us, why would you publish that information? What sense does it make to have that out there, given that they are wanted by the police? And if they were to travel to Europe, they would be handcuffed and maybe you'd see a trial. And I mean, there's not a really good answer I can give you other than to say it's in the public interest. We do discuss this internally, and there are sometimes people who argue against publishing. But I think that we also, like, what we then do is talk with as many people as possible, and other folks told us, listen, there's supposed to be a war that's going to start. This was 1 week prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And no way they're going to travel now. And who knows what's going to happen with the war. And we always have to consider, if you don't publish, and somebody finds out that we didn't publish, how would that make us look if we selectively choose to not publish articles because somebody told us not to do? That's a tough spot to be in. I don't want to be in that spot, so we published that story given the constraints.
We have time for one more question. If we have no more questions, I have a question. Given the way things are going, do you think that malware analysis is going to be taught by the journalist training schools in the future?
So what I do experience is many more journalists who have a background in natural language processing or somewhat like information science, they start to look at that stuff themselves because there's so much valuable information out there. I myself dabbled a little bit with Remnox and so on just to do that type of thing, but it's hard to do, and the reason I don't do it as thoroughly is I'm afraid I'll infect my laptop, so it's hard to do.
Thank you very much, Hakan.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Hakan for